Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to take a look at the latest economic data coming out of Russia because we've now had some really interesting new numbers on inflation, economic growth and interest rates. And when you put all of these figures together, they tell you a very worrying story about what's currently happening inside the Russian economy. Inflation remains significantly above target, food inflation is rising again, gasoline prices are surging, transportation costs are increasing, and Russia is dealing with disruption to its refinery network and logistics systems. Yet at exactly the same time, the Bank of Russia is actually cutting interest rates. So why is Russia reducing interest rates when inflation is still too high? And what does that tell us about the underlying health of the Russian economy? Well, that's what we're going to look at in today's episode. And for those of you who've been missing the graphs recently, don't worry because we've got plenty of them in today's video. But before we get into the details, if you're enjoying my videos, could you give me a thumbs up please? And also subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you have the option, if you can see that hype button, which is a relatively new thing on YouTube, it's alongside where the thumbs up is. Basically what that does is it helps promote this video a little bit more with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face if you could hit it. So let's start with inflation. The latest figures show that Russia's annual inflation rate has remained at 6% in July. Now that's virtually unchanged from June. At first glance, you could argue that that's a relatively assuring position because inflation hasn't got any higher. But the problem becomes much clearer when we look at where Russia was only a couple of months ago. Back in May, inflation had fallen to 5.3%. So it looked as if the Bank of Russia was making good progress in getting prices back under control. Instead, inflation jumped back up to 6% in June and has remained there in July. And that matters because the Bank of Russia has an official inflation target of only 4%. In other words, inflation is currently running around 50% above the target level. The detail underneath the headline number is arguably even more interesting. Gasoline inflation accelerated sharply in July to around 26%, compared with 20%, which was also very high, in June. Passenger transport inflation rose to just over 9% in July, and core inflation increased from 5% to 5.2%. And core inflation is important because it attempts to strip out some of the more volatile price movements and gives us a better indication of underlying inflationary pressure. So although headline inflation didn't move higher in July, several important components underneath it did. There was some better news in the monthly figures. Consumer prices increased by around 0.5% in July, compared with 0.9% in June. The Bank of Russia also argues that underlying inflation is considerably lower than the headline number and that some of the recent increases have been caused by temporary factors. But fuel is clearly becoming a major problem for Russia. The Bank of Russia itself highlighted the substantial increase in fuel prices when it raised its full-year inflation forecast to 7% for 2026. And this is where the war is increasingly feeding directly into the domestic Russian economy. Ukraine has stepped up attacks on Russian oil refineries, reducing the amount of gasoline and diesel available within Russia. By early July, Russian gasoline production had fallen by 65% compared with normal seasonal consumption, forcing the authorities to redirect fuel around the country and increase imports. So it stopped exporting gasoline and is now actually buying gasoline from other countries. That is quite extraordinary when you think about it. Russia is one of the world's largest oil producers, yet it's been experiencing domestic fuel shortages. And the economic consequences spread well beyond gasoline stations. Russia is an enormous country geographically. Goods regularly have to travel thousands of miles before reaching their final destination. Food needs to move from farms to processors and then into towns and cities. Components used in industry have to travel between factories. Retailers need deliveries, construction companies need materials to be delivered. All of these activities require transportation, and transportation requires fuel. Russian trucking companies are now reporting that freight rates increased by around 15% in July, while costs on some individual routes rose significantly more than that. Diesel can represent around 30% of the cost of running a freight operation, so a sharp increase in fuel prices very quickly feeds into the cost of moving almost everything around Russia. And that brings us on to the topic of food. Food inflation in Russia had fallen to around 2.9% in May. However, by June, it had risen to 3.4%, and in July, it's increased to 4.4%. So in the space of just 2 months, food inflation has increased by around 50%. Now, food inflation is particularly important because it doesn't affect everybody equally. Someone earning a very high salary may only spend a relatively small proportion of their income on groceries. But for people on lower incomes, food, heating, and transportation can account for a much larger percentage of everything that they have. As a result, rising food prices disproportionately hurt the poorest members of society. There's also a risk that higher transportation costs continue feeding into food prices over the next few months, because farmers need fuel, food processors need energy, supermarkets need to pay for deliveries. If each stage becomes more expensive, eventually somebody has to absorb those additional costs. And very often, that somebody is the consumer, you and me. Which leads us to the really interesting part of this story. In normal circumstances, what should a central bank do when inflation is significantly above target? Well, generally speaking, it will increase interest rates. Higher rates make borrowing more expensive. Consumers are encouraged to save rather than spend because interest rates are high. Businesses think twice about taking out loans to invest or expand. Demand therefore slows down, and eventually that brings inflation back under control. But Russia is currently moving in the opposite direction. The Bank of Russia cut interest rates again in July, taking its key rate from 14.25% to 14%. That continued the easing cycle, which started when rates had been sitting at an extraordinarily high 21%. Even after all of those reductions, a 14% base rate is still incredibly restrictive for the economy. If you think about what this means for ordinary Russian businesses, if you want to borrow money to open another factory, buy machinery, increase production, or expand your workforce, the actual commercial borrowing rate you're offered is likely to be substantially higher than the central bank's 14% benchmark. It might be as much as 20%. That makes investment extremely expensive. So even though the Bank of Russia has been reducing rates, monetary conditions remain very tight. And that's where we arrive at the contradiction. Inflation is running at around 6%. The official target rate for inflation is only 4%. Gasoline inflation is sitting at 26%, and food inflation has accelerated over the past couple of months. Core inflation has also edged higher. Yet interest rates, which should combat inflation, are actually being reduced. Now, in terms of what the Bank of Russia is saying about inflation, they're saying it doesn't matter. Its argument is that underlying inflationary pressures have improved sufficiently to allow gradual reductions, while a 14% interest rate is still restrictive enough to suppress demand. But there is another reason why Russia desperately needs lower rates. The economy is struggling to generate meaningful growth. And this brings us on to the latest GDP data. Russia's preliminary figures suggest the economy grew by 1.3% year on year in the second quarter of 2026. Now, on the face of it, that's a positive number, particularly because GDP had actually contracted during the first quarter. But I think we need to be really careful about what actually 1.3% tells us. The important question isn't simply whether Russia generated economic growth, it's where that growth is coming from. Russia is still operating what's effectively a wartime economy. The state continues to spend enormous amounts of money on defence, military production, security, and industries supplying the war effort. Government money flows into factories, it pays for salaries, it creates orders for suppliers, it supports employment, and ultimately, some of that money makes its way into consumer spending. This is one of the reasons Russia continues to report surprisingly resilient retail sales. But strong retail spending doesn't necessarily mean that Russian households are suddenly becoming substantially wealthier. One of the defining features of Russia's wartime economy has been an extraordinary shortage of workers. The military need personnel, Defense factories needs more employees, companies supplying those factories need staff, civilian companies then have to compete with those employers for the same shrinking pool of available labour. The result has been intense wage pressure, and ordinarily higher wages sounds like fantastic news. But there is a problem if wages are rising substantially faster than productivity. If companies are paying employees more money without producing proportionately more goods and services, those higher costs have to be absorbed somewhere. They can reduce company profits, or they can be passed through in the form of higher prices. At the same time, higher nominal wages give households more money to spend, so retail sales rise. But that doesn't necessarily mean people are buying dramatically more goods. Part of the increase in expenditure can simply reflect the fact that prices themselves are now higher, and suddenly the apparently positive numbers start looking slightly different. The Russian state spends heavily supporting the war economy. That spending creates demand for labour. Worker shortages push wages higher. Higher wages support consumer spending. Businesses face rising labour and input costs, therefore prices increase. Inflation remains above target, and the Bank of Russia is then forced to keep interest rates at extremely high levels. This is why I don't think the conclusion from 1.3% GDP growth should be simply that the Russian economy is recovering. A much more interesting interpretation is that Russia is still managing to generate some growth through enormous levels of state expenditure, but the economic cost of doing this is becoming increasingly visible. And there's also another important point here. Russia's economy expanded by more than 4% in both 2023 and 2024. That was the period when the initial wartime stimulus was having an enormous impact. Now, despite continued government spending, Russia's own government expects economic growth across the whole of 2026 to only be 0.4%. So think about what that tells us. The government is still spending very heavily, unemployment remains extremely low, there are major labour shortages, wages have been pushed higher, large parts of industry connected with defence continue receiving state support, yet after all of that, economic growth for the entire year for Russia is less than half of 1%. That suggests Russia is having to spend increasingly large amounts of money simply to generate increasingly small amounts of growth. And that's not necessarily evidence of economic strength. Potentially it's evidence that the wartime economic model is becoming less effective and more expensive to maintain. The Bank of Russia itself had previously acknowledged that large-scale fiscal stimulus contributed to excessive demand and overheating within the economy. Eventually, there are limits to how far that model can be pushed. More government expenditure adds pressure to the budget. More demand in an economy already suffering from labour shortages generates inflation. Higher inflation prevents the central bank from reducing interest rates aggressively, and high interest rates hurt civilian companies trying to invest and expand. That creates a dangerous dependency. The industries benefiting from government contracts continue receiving money. Meanwhile, businesses outside the defence sector have to contend with expensive borrowing, labour shortages, rise in wages, higher transportation costs, and also the sanctions against Russia. In effect, the war economy can crowd out parts of the normal civilian economy, and the longer that continues, the greater the risk that Russia becomes increasingly dependent on government expenditure simply to maintain economic activity. That problem is being compounded by Russia's deteriorating fiscal position. The federal government recorded a budget deficit of around 5.7 trillion rubles during the first 6 months of 2026, equivalent to approximately 2.5% of GDP. Obviously, government spending and tax receipts aren't distributed evenly throughout the year, so we shouldn't simply double that figure to assume where Russia finishes. Nevertheless, it illustrates the amount of pressure already building on government finances. At the same time, physical attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure are adding another layer of economic damage. Russia's seaborne exports of refined oil products fell by around 33% in July compared with June, and more than 50% compared with July of 2025, according to industry data and Russia's calculations. The Orsk refinery has also been forced offline after Ukrainian drone attacks. Repairs could potentially take months because some of the equipment required is imported and has become considerably harder to obtain because of sanctions. And I think that demonstrates how the sanctions and physical attacks are working together against Russia. Sanctions haven't caused the Russian economy to collapse. Russia has adapted. Trade has been redirected. Alternative suppliers have been found. China and India and other countries have become more important to the Russian economy. But adaptation doesn't mean there is no economic cost. Sanctions can make replacing equipment much harder to find. They can increase transportation costs. They complicate financial transactions. They reduce competition between suppliers. And when important infrastructure is damaged, getting everything back online can become slower and much more expensive. The same principle applies to the Ukrainian drone campaign. One damaged refinery isn't going to destroy the Russian economy. Neither is one disrupted logistics facility or one fuel shortage. But repeated attacks create cumulative costs. Fuel becomes more expensive, transportation costs rise, insurance costs go through the roof, and supply chains become less reliable. Therefore, businesses have to find alternatives, and the state ultimately has to intervene. And all of those things make the economy less efficient. That's why I think these latest economic numbers are so interesting. There is no single statistic here telling us that Russia is about to suffer an economic collapse. The latest GDP figure was actually positive. But when you put everything together, you can see how difficult the balancing act is becoming. Inflation remains around 50% above target. Food inflation is now rising again. Gasoline inflation has hit 26%. Transport costs are rising. Interest rates are sitting at an extraordinarily high 14%. The budget is therefore under pressure. Economic growth has slowed dramatically from the initial wartime boom, and the physical consequences of the war are increasingly feeding into everyday economic activity inside Russia itself. The Bank of Russia therefore finds itself trying to solve two opposing problems. It needs sufficiently high interest rates to control inflation, but at the same time, it desperately needs to lower borrowing costs because keeping rates at 14% damages businesses, investment, and future economic growth. If fuel shortages and higher transportation costs continue feeding through into consumer prices, that balancing act becomes even more difficult. And that's why the next few months will be particularly important. If inflation remains around 6%, food prices continue rising, and fuel costs remain elevated, the Bank of Russia has much less room to keep reducing interest rates. But if rates remain close to 14%, the pressure on civilian businesses continues. And that's the major dilemma. Russia has successfully kept its economy functioning despite sanctions and several years of war. But increasingly, keeping that system going appears to require enormous amounts of government expenditure while producing progressively weaker economic growth. And the danger for Russia is that the longer the war continues, the more difficult, expensive, and inefficient that economic model becomes. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. I'm trying to provoke some thoughts, get you thinking in different ways. Don't just look at a headline and assume that that is the story. Think about what it actually means. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget to hit that hype button if it's available, because it really will help this video to do better, which is great, and I really appreciate your support with that. Thank you so much to everyone that's supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you for that support. Really does help to keep me focused and making as many videos as possible. As you'll probably know by now, I'm not able to share with you a video at the end to put a smile on your face due to YouTube restrictions. But hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, and thank you very much for watching it all the way through to the end.